Today we're going into Revelation chapter 17, and we're getting closer to the climactic events, if you will, of this entire book, the whole thing, things that we've seen so far. And as an aside, actually the interpretation of this particular chapter really sets the stage really for the interpretation of the entire book of Revelation. It seems to be that was the focus. That these things that we are going to see are the ones for which the Lord revealed to John, these truths leading up to this great judgment, and primarily as shown in this image that we see today. And we see, and we're only going to be able to look at the first 6 verses today. It's kind of an introduction, if you will, to what we're going to see. And right off, we start off with this talking about one of these 7 angels who had these 7 bowls, had come to John and spoke to him. And by doing that, it kind of ties this section of Scripture to what we just saw last chapter of the 7 angels with their 7 bowls, and breaking what we'd seen in the last few. We got to the 7th of the seals, the 7th of the trumpet. Now we went to the 7th of the bowls, but there wasn't anything that flowed out of it, like another 7 of something. And so this kind of culminates what's going on. And we have to recognize this as an overthought, that we talk about this individual, this location called Babylon. And there's been a lot of discussion about it. We've spent a few lessons together in Sunday school trying to get a handle on Babylon. And for the most part, throughout history, most of the church fathers, most individuals who've interpreted, have assumed and felt like Babylon was a softer way of saying Rome, and that they were saying Babylon because at this time they're still under the Roman emperorship, the control of the Roman Empire. They are the ones that had the soldiers on the streets, and the soldiers had swords. And so they kind of shied away from identifying all these events and talking about Rome, because that's the last thing they wanted to have, is to draw attention to themselves more than what had already happened. And some have gone on and said, well, this could represent Rome itself. It could, in fact, stand for the whole Roman Empire. They said, well, the 7 hills of Rome really represent the 7 dynasties of Rome, from Augustus all the way to Domitian, who we have here, and that these 10 kings were sub-rulers under the Roman control. Of course, Jerusalem had a king. So that's possible. However, there are some things that we want to think about. There's actually a little bit more. The Jews and the Christians of that day thought Babylon was Rome. And as I said before, it had all these great things. And at this stage, 80, 85 maybe, Rome had gotten into serious persecution of Christians. It didn't necessarily start with Nero, but as we've seen from our understanding of history, the Romans hated Jews. In fact, they had to make a special accommodation because the Jews are always trouble. No, we're not going to say that the Roman emperor is a god. No, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to take Zeus and say that's really another name for Yahweh, and vice versa. We're not going to do that. But when we look at the details of what John has recorded here, and understanding what he says about Babylon and the things and the circumstances about Babylon, I tend to think, and many think, that you really can't particularly pinpoint an identification of just, if this was a city, which one it would be. I mean, it could be the ancient Babylon itself. It could be representative of Sodom. It could represent the capitals of Egypt. It could it could reply to either Rome or even Jerusalem. But I don't think that's what we can possibly see, how that is what is possible. And we look at John's focus. He really talks about this roaming, this Babylonian description really is kind of I would say, an archetype of Satan's deceptions that he's been doing in many ways, and in fact, a whole worldwide resistance to everything about God. And so we know that when we look at, if we think about that, this is actually talking about a system, I hate to use the term political system, theological system, however you want. This chapter itself really serves as kind of an appendix to the last bowl we saw earlier. Obviously, these first 6 verses that we're going to look at really gives us a look at just who this great harlot is. And then the latter part, verses 7 and through 18, the last part of it, is really kind of an interpretation of what John is seeing here. So we have this one of these 7 angels, which I said kind of connects us to what we saw earlier on. And he commands John to come and see, or as some would translate it. Now, back in my background, we knew that Missouri, the state of Missouri, is known as the Show Me State. You know, I'm not going to believe it till you show me. And that's how they got that nickname. But I thought it was kind of interesting, and this is something, a lot of guys don't see this. You know, the phrase come and see appears a lot of places in the Bible. Can any of you think of any places that you've seen someone say, come and see?
Come and see this man that does all these wonders.
Well, who said that?
Oh, I don't remember.
Well, I think if we think real hard, I think we might consider that might have been Andrew, who went to Simon, later called Peter. You know, we see this, come and see. And also later on, it happened again. Philip said to his brother Nathaniel, come and see.
Mary say on the day of resurrection when Christ to come and see the empty tomb?
I don't know if that was the same thing as command. No, I didn't find that. But we do know that when Lazarus died, she told Jesus, you know, talking about the tomb, he said, come and see. And then, of course, we saw it in chapter 6 of Revelation 4 more times. And so, you know, there's something about bringing someone to the physical presence or the location that does, you know, I can tell you all about going to the Wisconsin Dells. But if you go and see them, get on a boat, a raft, whatever, and go down there, it's a little different. You know, I could tell you about Pikes Peak, but unless you're there, you know. I could say about going to the Capitol up the top of the Washington Monument. You know, I have not done that either. But there's something about seeing, and so this angel wants John to, you know, he'd been telling these things, he'd been seeing some of them, but this is different. He's taking John to another location, and he's going to see this great harlot, this great prostitute, and he's going to be overwhelmed. And of course, as he would admit, and we would admit, if John really spent all he needed to completely and extensively describe what he saw, this book would be much, much bigger. And I think that might be what's going on. And of course, and they describe this woman as a great prostitute. And they're not talking about the trade and the physical particulars of that, but I think it's really representational of just rampant idolatry. And I think that might be, we saw that in Revelation 2, where they talked about this rampant idolatry. And what he sees is this person sitting on many waters. And no one dealt with this. You know, so you can't sit on water unless it's frozen. You know, we have ice fishermen. And what do they mean by sitting? You know, for example, we know for those who have chickens, hens sit, well, brooding, sit on their eggs. Yeah, that's one possibility. We do know in many cases that when we elect congressional and governmental individuals, they sit in a seat of office. You know, so that's really, you know, they're doing something like that. And maybe this latter one is what he's talking about. This Babylon, who's sitting on many waters, is actually showing that Babylon rules or directs or leads or even responsible for these many waters. Now we get an interpretation a little bit farther down, Lord willing, we'll get next week. It says that these many waters, verse 15 says, these waters you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples, multitudes, nations, and language. And we've seen that grouping of four a lot. So the entire worldwide system is under the control of this great prostitute. And so he sees